The thermometer nailed to the post outside Cormac Dre's freight office read 17 below zero on the morning of January the 8th, 1881. The road up Raven Grade had been gone for 11 days, buried under drifts that reached the eaves of the lower cabins and turned the familiar landmarks of Black Hills country into an unbroken white nothing that stretched from ridge to ridge without interruption. Cormac had been hauling freight between Pierre and the mining camps for 9 winters. He had buried 2 men to the cold, one of them, a teamster who had worked beside him for 3 years, a man with a wife in Deadwood and hands so scarred from rope and frostbite that he could not fully close his fingers even in August. Cormac knew what winter could do. He had learned it the hard way, the way everyone learned it out here, by watching it happen to someone who thought they were prepared. He was not thinking about any of that on the morning of January the 8th. He was thinking about the woman on the shelf above the grade, the 65-year-old Norwegian widow with the 8-year-old boy in the dry well and $47 to her name, who had refused to go east when he told her plainly that she could not survive. He had been wrong before, not often, but he had been wrong before. He did not let himself think too hard about whether this was one of those times. The story begins 16 months earlier, in the September of 1879, on a day when the aspen on the north-facing ridges were just beginning to turn and the air still carried the last warmth of summer in the late afternoon, though you could feel what was coming underneath it the way you feel the cold of deep water before you have fully entered it. Ingrid Halston buried her father on a Tuesday. She had buried her husband 2 years before that in the same rocky ground at the edge of the same mining camp, a place called Pine Coulee, that sat on a shelf above Raven Grade in the southern Black Hills, accessible in good weather by a switchback road that a careful teamster could navigate in under an hour, and inaccessible in bad weather in ways that were not theoretical. Her husband Arvid had died in a milling accident at Whitewood Creek, crushed by machinery that should have been shut down for maintenance and wasn't, because the men who owned the machinery had made a calculation about costs that did not include Arvid Halston's life in any meaningful way. He left her with a son, a claim, and debts that seemed to grow on their own like something alive. The son died of a fever 2 months after his father, which was the kind of thing that happened in the Black Hills in 1877, and which nobody had a good explanation for, and nobody tried very hard to explain, because there was always more dying and the living had work to do. What remained was Gus, 8 years old. Arvid's grandson by his first marriage, orphaned by the same fever that took his father, brought to Pine Coulee by a woman who was already grieving 2 deaths and who looked at this child with his grandfather's stubborn jaw and his grandmother's pale eyes and understood that she was not going to put him anywhere. He was hers now. That was the end of the question. And so when Ingrid buried her father Aslak in September of 1879, she did it with Gus standing beside her, his small hand in hers, his grip tightening every time the wind moved through the pines on the ridge above them. And she knew he was waiting for her to say something that would make the world make sense. She had nothing to say. The world did not make sense. It had not made sense for 2 years, and she had stopped waiting for it to start. She pressed his hand and looked at the head frame of her father's, well visible from the cemetery, the weathered gray timber standing against the September sky like a question that had never been answered. And she thought about what she was walking back to. Aslak Halston had spent 10 years digging a well that everyone in Pine Coulee agreed was a failure. He had started it in 1869, the year Ingrid and Arvid arrived in the Black Hills, filed a claim on the shelf above the grade, and began building what Arvid called their future, and what Ingrid even then recognized as a prayer dressed up in lumber and ambition. Aslak had come with them 61 years old and still capable of a full day's work, with the particular stubbornness of Norwegian men who have decided on something and cannot be redirected by anything short of physical catastrophe. He wanted water. The spring-fed creek at the bottom of the grade was reliable, but a long haul up a steep road, and a man who had water on his own claim did not have to negotiate with the terrain every time he needed a bucket for the stock. So Aslak started digging. He went down through topsoil and clay, and then into fractured rock that required hand drills, and patience and a particular quality of anger that certain men carry like a tool. He went 20 feet, 30, 40. The camp watched with the interest that frontier communities showed toward any project ambitious enough to potentially fail in a spectacular way. By the time he was 60 feet down, the interest had curdled into something more comfortable and more cruel. Laughter is easier than sympathy, and Aslak's well became the thing you pointed to when you wanted to explain to a newcomer why the Black Hills rewarded some men and not others, why the difference between success and ruin was often not effort, but judgment. They called it Halston's folly. Then they shortened it to the folly. Then when enough time had passed and the joke was stale, they just called it the dry well because that was what it was. A hole in the ground that had never given anyone anything worth keeping. Except that it had, and nobody knew. Ingrid came back to the shack on the afternoon of the burial and stood in the doorway while Gus slipped his past her to sit on the rope bed and look at his hands. The September light fell across the board floor in a slant that would be gone in an hour. She counted what she could see. A half cord of split pine against the north wall, a burlap sack of flour maybe 8 pounds, a crock of lard, dried beans in a jar, salt, coffee grounds she had already used twice, a tin of matches, 2 blankets that still smelled like her father even though she had washed them. She crossed to the table and opened the tobacco tin where Aslak had kept the household money. $47, she counted it twice. Then she sat down and stared at the coins and the few paper notes until her eyes burned and the light outside had shifted from gold to gray and Gus had fallen asleep on the bed with his boots still on. $47, 1 child, no team, no husband, no family east that she could reach before winter, and no family east that would take her in even if she could. The numbers came to her that night, the way bad numbers always come in pieces, each one sharper than the last, each one arriving just as you were beginning to recover from the one before. A household of 2 needed flour beans, salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, and enough wood to keep a stove fed from first frost to thaw. That was the minimum. That was what would keep them alive if nothing went wrong, if neither of them got sick, if the winter came late and left early, if Silas Oryx prices at the company store did not climb as the road worsened. She did not know the exact figures, but she knew enough. She had watched her father calculate for a decade, and she understood the shape of the problem, even when she could not yet draw its edges. In the morning, she left Gus with Dot Bryn at the boarding house and walked down to the freight station at the bottom of the grade. Cormac Dre was checking manifests against crates when she arrived, his breath steaming in the early chill, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who has repeated the same task so many thousand times that he no longer needs to think about it. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been rearranged by weather and hard work into something that suggested competence without warmth. He had the particular manner of men who spend their lives measuring weights and distances, who understand the world in terms of what it costs to move things from one place to another and whether anyone can afford the freight. He looked at Ingrid when she stepped forward, and she saw in his eyes what she had not expected to see. Not contempt, not dismissal, something worse than either. Recognition. He had seen this before. He knew what it looked like, and he knew how it ended, and his face said both of those things without saying anything at all. She asked him what it would cost to haul 4 months of provisions up to the claim on the shelf. Flour and beans and salt pork. Wood. Cormac did not answer right away. He took off his hat and ran his hand through thinning hair that had been brown once and was now the color of old pewter. And then he put the hat back on and looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has been asked to solve when the numbers don't work. He pulled a stub of pencil from his vest pocket and a scrap of paper from the crate beside him. He wrote slowly the way a man writes when he is doing arithmetic he does not want to do. Flour, he said, 200 pounds minimum, at current prices, $11. Beans, 100 pounds, $4. Salt pork, 50 pounds, $6. Lard, coffee, salt, lamp oil, small goods call it $8. That is $29 for food, and I am being generous. I am assuming you eat thin and the boy does not grow. Ingrid listened. She did not move. Hauling a wagon up Raven Grade when the road is still good, Cormac continued, costs $2 per 100 pounds plus a handling fee. By November, when the road is uncertain, it costs $3. By December, if the road is still open at all, it costs $4, and you pay extra for the risk. You are looking at another $15 to $20 just to get the food to your claim. He stopped writing. He looked at her. That is $45 to $50, and I have not mentioned wood. She had half a cord. Half a cord, he repeated. Half a cord is 2 weeks, maybe 3 if you burn cold and wear every blanket you own. You need 5 cords minimum, 6 is safer. You cannot buy wood at town prices. You cut it yourself or you hire someone. The men who cut wood for hire are already booked through October. You could offer to pay, but you would need $30 just for the labor, and that assumes you can find anyone willing to climb up to that shelf for a widow they do not know. Ingrid stood very still. The numbers assembled themselves in her head. $47. Food and hauling $50. Wood labor $30. The gap was not a crack, it was a canyon. What would you do, she asked, if you were me? Cormac put the pencil back in his pocket. He folded the paper and held it out to her, and she took it without looking at what he had written. If I were you, he said, and his voice was not unkind, I would take the boy and go east before the first snow. Find relatives, find a church, find anyone who will take you in, because what you are describing is not a plan. It is a prayer, and the winter does not answer prayers. He paused. His eyes moved to the head frame visible on the shelf above the gray timber against the sky. That hole your father dug, he said, it will not feed the boy. Come January, you will understand what I mean. She did not go east. She went back to the boarding house and collected Gus and paid Bryn 2 cents for the watching and walked back up the grade to the claim. She built a fire in the stove and cooked beans and gave Gus his portion and ate her own standing by the window looking out at the head frame in the fading light. That hole your father dug, it will not feed the boy. Cormac Dre was not a cruel man. That was what made his words stick the way they stuck. He was not trying to hurt her. He was trying to save her the pain of hoping when hoping would cost her everything. He had seen this before. He knew how it ended. But Ingrid could not leave. She could not explain it in a way that would satisfy Cormac or Dot or anyone else, and she did not try. It was not stubbornness, though people would call it that. It was not foolishness, though they would call it that too. It was something simpler and harder than either. She had nowhere to go. Her mother had been dead for 20 years. The family in Minnesota that she and Arvid had left behind had scattered into the distances that the American West creates between people, the kind of distance that is not measured in miles. Her husband's people had never acknowledged her existence with any warmth. There was no church that knew her name east of the Missouri that would take in a 63-year-old Norwegian woman with a child that was not technically hers and a debt load that was technically hers and nothing else to recommend her. There was only the claim, the shack, the head frame, and the child who trusted her to keep him alive. That night, after Gus fell asleep, she sat at the table with a tobacco tin and counted the $47 one more time. Then she opened the other tin, the flat one her father had kept his papers in, and spread the contents across the table. Receipts. The deed to the claim. A letter from her mother dated 1861, the year before Ingrid was born. Notes in her father's cramped handwriting about the well depths and soil types and timber needs and the date he hit bedrock and the date he gave up on finding water. At the bottom of the pile was a single sheet of paper folded twice and sealed with a disc of candle wax pressed flat. She turned it over in her hands. The wax was undisturbed. Whatever was inside had been written and sealed and placed here and left waiting for her to find it, or waiting for someone to find it, or perhaps not waiting for anything at all, just existing the way her father had existed quietly and without explanation. She cracked the seal with her thumbnail and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was her father's. The words were in Norwegian and then repeated in English, as if he had not been sure which language she would need. The well is not dry. It is finished. Do not tell anyone what is at the bottom. She read the words 3 times. She did not understand them. Her father had complained about the well for years, cursed it in 3 languages, apologized to anyone who would listen for wasting a decade on a fool's errand. Dry was the word he used, always dry. The dry well, Halston's folly, the hole that proved even Norwegians could be fools. But he had written something else before he died, hidden it in the tin with his papers, sealed it with wax, and never told her. The well is not dry, it is finished. Ingrid looked through the window at the head frame in the dark. The moon was rising behind the ridge, and the gray timber caught enough light to stand out against the black sky. Her heart was doing something she had not felt it do in 2 years. Not hope exactly, something that came before hope, the moment just before you let yourself believe something might be true. She knew she should sleep. She knew she should wait for morning, for light, for the particular clarity that comes from having rested. But the words on the paper would not let her rest, and she understood with a certainty that surprised her that she had been looking at the problem wrong. She had been counting what she lacked. The absent husband, the absent team, the thin soil, the shack that leaned toward the grade as if it had given up on standing straight. She had not been counting what her father might have left behind. Dawn came cold and clear. She fed Gus porridge made thin with water and told him to stay inside near the stove until she came back. He nodded, his face serious in the way of children who have learned that serious faces are what adults need in serious moments. And she kissed his forehead and went out to the head frame. The windlass was old but functional. Her father had built it himself, oak drum and iron crank handle, and a rope that had seen better days, but would hold her weight if she was careful. She leaned over the shaft collar and looked down. Darkness. The ladder rungs her father had cut into the stone wall were visible for the first 10 feet. Then shadow swallowed everything. She tied a lantern to a length of cord and lowered it first, watching the small flame descend. 20 feet, 25, 30. The bottom appeared in the circle of yellow light. Packed earth, dry as the name suggested. No standing water, no mud. No sign of what the note had promised. She tested the first ladder rung with her foot. It held. She tied a rope around her waist, looped it over the windlass drum for safety, and began to descend. The shaft walls were cribbed timber for the first 12 feet, then raw stone. Her father had hit bedrock and kept going, chipping through with hand drills and patience, and whatever it is that drives a man to keep working at something the world has already decided is hopeless. The air grew cooler as she went down. Not cold, cool, stable. And there was a smell faint that reminded her of the root cellars she had known in Minnesota. Earth and stone and something preserved. At the bottom, her boots touched packed soil. She unhooked the lantern from the cord and held it out, letting the light spread. The shaft ended in a wall of stone, but cut into that stone at hip height was an oak door. She stood very still. Her heart was in her throat. Not fear exactly, something larger than fear, something that included fear the way a storm includes rain. The door had iron hinges and a simple latch. She lifted the latch and pulled. The door swung outward on hinges that moved without sound, oiled and maintained, and cool air flowed past her face and the lantern light fell into a room. The chamber was roughly 12 by 18 feet with a ceiling high enough that she did not have to stoop. The walls were dressed stone, where they met the bedrock, and timber, where the ceiling braces ran, and the floor was compacted earth covered with a layer of sand. The air inside was cool and dry and still, the kind of still that only exists underground, where no wind has ever reached and no season has ever changed anything. But it was not the chamber that stopped her breath. It was what the chamber contained. Wooden bins lined the walls, slatted for air circulation, each one labeled in her father's handwriting. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets. The root vegetables lay in sand packed in careful layers, the sand slightly damp to the touch. Higher on the wall, netted shelves held onions, hung dry, separated from the moisture below by a deliberate distance that she recognized even then as intentional rather than accidental. In the far corner, grain barrels stood on wooden runners that lifted them an inch from the floor. She counted 4. Wheat, oats, rye, beans. Near the inner wall farthest from the door, 2 smoked hams and several sides of salt pork hung from iron hooks driven into the timber. On a slate board mounted beside the door, her father had chalked marks in neat columns. Dates, counts, notes about vent positions she did not yet understand. A small diagram showed the shaft above with 2 lines marked and arrows indicating airflow. Ingrid lowered the lantern and stood in the center of the chamber. Her hands were shaking. Aslak Halston had not spent 10 years digging a dry well. He had spent 10 years building a vault. And he had built it below the frost line, down in the stable cold of bedrock, where temperature stayed constant regardless of what the sky was doing above. He had built it with ventilation that moved air without letting moisture accumulate. He had stored everything exactly as it needed to be stored: roots and sand, onions, high and dry grain off the floor, meat hung in the coldest zone. She crossed to the nearest bin and lifted a potato. Firm, clean, no softness. She opened a grain barrel and let a handful of wheat run through her fingers, dry and whole. She lifted an onion from the netted shelf and pressed it gently. Solid all the way through. Everything in this chamber was alive. Everything had been kept exactly right. She did not know how much food was here. She would have to count. But standing in the cool silence of her father's secret, she understood for the first time that the arithmetic might be different than she had believed. The counting took most of the day. She brought Gus down on the second trip, a rope around his waist, her hands guiding his feet to the rungs. He was frightened on the ladder the way children are frightened by things that are dark and enclosed and outside the boundaries of everything they have been told is normal. But when he stepped through the oak door and she lifted the lantern and let him walk between the bins and touch the grain barrels and look up at the hanging meat, the fear left his face and something else came in. "Grandfather built this," he said. "Yes." Why did he not tell anyone? She looked at the door at the hinges set clean into the stone at the marks her father had chalked on the slate board. The records of a man who had been watching this chamber for years, adjusting and monitoring and maintaining something that no one else knew existed. I think she said he did not trust anyone else to keep it safe. She sent Gus back up to tend the stove and began her count. 60 bushels of potatoes, maybe 65. 12 bushels of turnips. 9 bushels of carrots in sand. 6 bushels of beets. 40 pounds of onions. 4 grain barrels each holding between 80 and 100 pounds. Salt pork perhaps 60 pounds. 2 smoked hams. She wrote the numbers on the slate board beneath her father's marks and stared at them until her eyes watered. This was not a larder for one household. This was a reserve, a vault built to carry people through a siege. But she did not know if it would hold. She did not know if the potatoes would stay firm through January, or if the grain would develop mold she could not see yet, or if she was misreading the conditions that her father had spent years learning to maintain. She had watched him store food. She had never run a cellar herself. The knowledge she had was fragments, half-remembered rules, warnings without the understanding that made them useful. She needed to learn fast, and she needed to decide before she told anyone whether what she had found was as sound as it appeared, or whether she was about to trust her life and Gus's life to something that would fail in ways she could not predict. Dot Bryn came to check on her 3 days after the burial. She brought a loaf of bread and a jar of preserved peaches and stood in the doorway of the shack with her arms crossed, looking at Ingrid the way a woman looks at another woman she is genuinely worried about and does not want to show it. Dot was 42 years old. She had run the Pine Coulee boarding house since her husband died in the homestead collapse of 1876. She understood the practical architecture of survival in ways that most people who had not spent years keeping a frontier establishment alive could not fully appreciate. She knew how to stretch a dollar until it apologized. She knew how to keep a kitchen fed on what other people would have called nothing. She knew how to run a cellar that sweated under the floorboards and lost half its stores to moisture every year, which was a kind of education in what could go wrong that was more useful than any amount of knowledge about what could go right. She was not unkind, but she did not believe in miracles. "I heard you went to see Cormac Dre," she said. "I did. And what did he tell you? The truth?" Dot nodded. "Then you know you cannot make it through winter on $47. Not without a team, not without more than half a quart of wood." Ingrid did not argue. She poured Dot a cup of weak coffee and set it on the table. "There is another way," she said. Dot raised an eyebrow. She did not pick up the cup. Ingrid hesitated. She had told no one about the chamber. She had counted and recounted and walked through the logic a dozen times, and she still did not know if she could trust what she had found, not because she doubted her father's work, but because she doubted her own ability to maintain it without understanding it fully. The potatoes might rot. The grain might spoil in ways she would not catch until too late. And she could not operate the vault alone, not with confidence, not through a Black Hills winter. She needed someone who understood what she was looking at. Dot Bryn had been keeping food alive in difficult conditions for longer than almost anyone in Pine Coulee. "I need to show you something," Ingrid said. Dot descended the ladder with the caution of a woman who did not trust promises. She held the rope with both hands and tested every rung before committing her weight, and when she reached the bottom and saw the oak door set into the stone, her face changed in a way that Ingrid had not seen Dot's face change before. "What is this?" she said. "My father's work." Ingrid lifted the latch and pushed the door open. Dot stepped through and stopped. She looked at the bins, the barrels, the hanging meat, the chalkboard, the sand around the roots, the netted shelves holding onions above the moisture line. She looked at all of it, and her expression moved through several things that were not quite disbelief and not quite recognition, settling finally on something hard to name. "Aslak built this." "Yes, while everyone called it a dry well." Dot walked to the nearest bin and lifted a potato. She turned it over, pressed her thumb against the skin, lifted it to her nose and smelled it. Then she did the same with a carrot, a turnip and onion. She opened a grain barrel and let the wheat run through her fingers the way Ingrid had done, checking the texture and the smell and the look of it. "It is sound," she said slowly. "All of it. This is 6 months of stores, maybe more." "That is what I thought." Dot looked at her. "You did not know what you had. I knew nothing. He never told me. I found a note in his papers after he died. It said the well was not dry. It said it was finished." Dot laughed, but there was nothing of humor in it. It was the sound of a woman confronting something that had rearranged what she thought she knew. "Finished," she said. "He finished it 10 years ago and nobody knew." She set the potato back in the bin and stood in the center of the chamber, turning slowly. Then her voice changed, sharpened. "You understand what this means," she said. "I think so." "No, you do not. Not yet." Dot's voice was direct the way it always was, without softness, but without cruelty either. "This food is sound today. It may not be sound in a month. Cellars fail, moisture comes, temperature shifts, rot spreads from one bad corner to an entire bin if you do not catch it early. You have never run a cellar in your life, I know. You know nothing. You have your father's marks on that board, and you have good food in the ground, and you have no idea how to keep it good through January. That is why I showed you," Ingrid said. "I need to learn from you, from anyone who will teach me." Dot was quiet for a long time. The lantern flame did not move in the still air. "Your father was a strange man," she said finally. "I thought he was a fool. Half the camp thought he was a fool." She walked to the chalkboard and studied the marks. "But this is not the work of a fool." She traced the columns with her finger. "He was tracking everything. Every variable that matters. Can you read it, most of it? The logic is clear, even where the symbols are his own." She turned back to Ingrid. "He understood this chamber better than I understand my own cellar. The ventilation design alone." She shook her head slightly. "Then the food is safe. The food is safe if you keep doing what he did. If you follow his records, check the vents, monitor the temperature, catch rot before it spreads." Dot's voice softened slightly by her standards. "But it is work every day. You cannot walk away and assume it holds." "I can work. For 4 months, 5 with a child to feed and a stove to tend and no one to help you." Ingrid met her eyes. "I do not have a choice." Dot stared at her for a long moment. Then she exhaled the breath of a woman who has made a decision she suspects she will not regret but cannot yet be sure about. "Show me the vents," she said. They spent 3 hours in the chamber that first day. Dot showed Ingrid how to read the vent positions, how to feel for moisture on the timber, how to identify the first signs of rot in a potato before the softness spread to the ones around it. She explained why onions went high and dry, why root vegetables needed sand, why grain had to stay off the floor even when the floor appeared dreary. She explained the logic of everything Aslak had built and why each element was where it was. Ingrid listened. She asked questions. She wrote in a small notebook she had brought with her, the same notation style her father had used on the chalkboard, because it was the most precise format available. When they climbed back up, Dot stood at the head frame and looked at Ingrid for a long moment. "You cannot tell anyone," Ingrid said. "Why not?" "Because the moment people know, they will come. And I do not know yet who I can trust, or how much I have, or whether I can keep it sound through winter. I need time." Dot nodded slowly. She understood the economics of scarcity. She understood what Silas Oric would do if he found out. Milo, she said, using the name people use for Oric when they were being less than precise, will want it. He will find a way to use your father's debts against you. He will find a way to take it. That is what I thought. So what will you do? Ingrid looked at the shaft color at the gray wood of the head frame against the September sky. "I will learn the system," she said. "I will keep it running, and I will keep my mouth shut until I know what I have and what it is worth and what it will take." Dot looked at her for another moment. Then she turned and walked down the grade toward town without another word. The secret lasted 9 days. Gus told a boy at the boarding house that his grandfather's well was cold inside. The other boy told his mother. The mother mentioned it to a neighbor. The neighbor said something to a freighter. And by the end of the first week of October, half of Pine Coulee had heard that Aslak Halston's dry well was not dry at all, and that his daughter was pulling food from it. Silas Oric heard it on the ninth day. He owned the company store that served Pine Coulee and the three camps above it, extending credit to minors and widows and anyone else who could not pay cash, collecting interest at rates that made men work twice as long to clear their debts as the original purchase should have required. He was 46 years old, not tall, but carrying himself like a man who had not been told no by anyone who mattered in a considerable stretch of time. He came to the claim at noon on a flat gray October day and stood at the head frame without knocking. Ingrid saw him from the window. She told Gus to stay inside and not open the door for anyone. Then she went out. "I hear your father left you something interesting," Oric said. She watched his face and did not answer. "The story going around is that old Aslak was building a root cellar all along, that he filled it with food before he died." Oric looked at the head frame. "Your father owed me $18 when he died. That debt passes to you with interest. Your husband owed another $12 before his accident. That debt also passes to you." Ingrid said nothing. $30 against 47. And now the vault was not a secret. Oric reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I have a proposal. I will forgive both debts in full. In exchange, you sign over the claim as security. If you make it through winter, it remains yours. If you fail, it becomes mine." He held out the paper. Ingrid did not take it. "What you are offering," she said, "is not forgiveness. It is purchase. You are betting I will fail and you will own the vault." Oric's expression did not change. "I am offering you a chance. Without help, you have $47 and winter coming. Think about it. Come see me when you are ready to be practical." He turned and walked back toward the grade. Ingrid watched him go. Then she went back inside and drove 4 iron spikes through the shaft cover and stood at the window looking out at the head frame in the failing light. She was still there when she heard boots on the path outside. Not Oric's boots. Someone moving differently, more carefully, the way very old men move when the ground is uneven and they are paying attention to it. She opened the door before the knock came. The man standing at the head frame was perhaps 67 years old, with a face that weather and underground work had turned into something that looked like the stone he had spent his life around. His hands were enormous, scarred at the knuckles, calloused in the specific pattern of a man who has swung a hammer in enclosed spaces for decades. He wore a coat patched at the elbows and held a hat that might have been black once. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the head frame, at the shaft collar, at the cribbing visible at the top of the shaft, reading it the way a person reads something written in a language they have spoken their whole life. "My name is Ragnar Skei," he said. "I worked with your father 15 years ago before he quit the drift. I heard what people are saying about the well." He paused. His pale eyes moved from the shaft to her face. "He finished it," Ragnar said. "I thought he was still testing the design." "He was not testing," Ingrid said. "He was building." Ragnar nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he already suspected. She looked at him. She looked at his hands. She thought about the marks on the chalkboard that she understood and the ones she did not. "The records he left," she said. "Some of the symbols I cannot read." Ragnar was quiet for a moment. "One day," he said finally, "I will give you one day. If you learn what I can show you in one day, I will come back." He was not offering charity. She understood that immediately. He was measuring something, whether she was worth the time, whether what her father had built was going to be maintained by someone who understood what it was or abandoned by someone who didn't. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I will make coffee and we will go down in the morning." The September dark was coming fast over the ridge to the east, and winter was 11 weeks away, and somewhere below the frost line in the bedrock of a shelf above Raven Grade, in a chamber that the whole camp had been standing above for 10 years, without knowing it was there, 6 months of food waited in the cool and the dark and the still air, exactly as Aslak Halston had left it. His daughter had found it. Now she had to learn to keep it alive. The one day became 2, then 3. Then a standing arrangement that neither of them named because naming it would have required a conversation that Ragnar Skei was not built for and Ingrid Halston did not need. He arrived at first light every other morning, moving up the grade from whatever room he rented in the lower camp with the careful economy of a very old man who has learned that his body will do what he asks of it if he does not ask too quickly. He brought tools, a hand auger for testing timber soundness, a chalk line for checking vertical, A small mirror he used to redirect lantern light into corners the direct flame could not reach. He taught the way men who have worked underground their whole lives teach, by doing, not by explaining what he was about to do, not by asking whether she understood not, by checking whether she had followed. He demonstrated once, then he watched her do it. Then he moved to the next thing. On the first morning, he made her test every timber brace in the chamber. Not look at them, test them. The method was a hammer in your ears. A solid timber rang with a note that was high and clean. A compromised timber made a sound that was lower, flatter, the sound of something that had begun to fail from the inside while looking fine from the outside. She went around the entire chamber systematically, brace by brace, and found two that made the wrong sound. Replace them, Ragnar said. With what? I have no timber. You have scrub pine on the claim. Cut 4 pieces, peel the bark, dry them near the stove for 3 days, turning twice a day. Set them before the hard freeze. She cut the timber that afternoon with an axe that had belonged to her father and whose handle she replaced with a length of ash she split herself. She peeled the bark with a draw knife Ragnar lent her without comment. She stacked the pieces near the stove and turned them morning and evening, and by the end of the week she had 2 new braces fitted into the chamber, seated properly in their sockets, making the right sound when she tapped them. Ragnar tapped each one twice, nodded once. Your father was the same, he said. He learned fast, and he did not need to be told things twice. That was the most he said about Aslak in those first weeks. It was also Ingrid understood a great deal. The second week was the vents. The chamber had 2 ventilation shafts, each one running from the ceiling up through rock and soil to the surface, emerging through small wooden boxes she had noticed, but not understood at the top of the headframe structure. One shaft pulled air down into the chamber. The other released it up and out. The difference in pressure between them created circulation that kept the air in the chamber from going dead, and dead air was where mold began. But the shafts had sliding shutters at the surface, small panels of wood set in grooves, and the position of those shutters determined everything. Open too wide in wet weather, Ragnar said, and you bring moisture in with the air. The roots will sweat. The grain will begin to soften at the surface where you will not see it until it has gone too far. Open too narrow and dry cold, and the temperature drops too fast, and the outer layer of the potato bins freezes. Close them entirely for more than a day, and the air goes dead and mold starts in the corners. He adjusted the intake shutter, moving it from half open to a quarter. Your father's marks on the board show the correct position for each weather condition. Study them, but the marks are notation. They are not instinct. Instinct takes time. How much time? More than you have before winter. So you will make mistakes, and you will catch them before they become disasters. That is the best available option. He was not trying to frighten her. He was telling her the truth, which was what she needed, and he seemed to understand that. She made mistakes. She adjusted the shutters wrong twice in the first 2 weeks and found condensation on the ceiling the next morning, water beating on the timber braces, running down the stone walls in thin lines. Ragnar showed her how to wipe it down with dry cloth before it dripped onto the grain barrels, working quickly and without drama. And then he showed her what she had done wrong with the shutters and how to read the conditions outside before she adjusted them. Mistakes are how you learn, he said. The question is whether you survive them. She survived them. She adjusted. She learned. October passed the way. October passes in the Black Hills with a kind of beauty that you can appreciate in the afternoon and fear by evening, because the color in the trees and the clarity of the high-altitude light are the same things that tell you what is coming. The aspens went gold. The nights went below freezing and stayed there. The ground hardened by degrees. Ingrid went down into the chamber every morning. She checked the temperature with the small mercury thermometer she had hung near the door on Ragnar's instruction. 36 degrees, 37. Stable. She felt the timber braces with her palm. She inspected the corners of the bins for the soft spots that were the first sign of rot spreading. She adjusted the shutters according to what the sky was doing and what her father's marks told her and what her own developing sense of the system was beginning to tell her. Gus came with her most mornings. He was 10 years old now, in the way that children are older than their stated age when circumstances have required it, and he had taken on the morning descent as something he understood to be his responsibility, in the household carrying the second lantern, holding it steady, while she checked the bins writing numbers on the slate board when her hands were full. He had memorized the shutter positions without being asked to memorize them. He knew the sound of a good timber brace and the sound of one that was beginning to fail. If something happens to me, she had told him one morning in November, you know where everything is. You know how it works. He had looked at her with his grandfather's eyes and said, nothing is going to happen to you. She had not argued, but she had made sure he knew anyway. November deepened. The temperature fell into the single digits and held there. The road to Deadwood became uncertain wagons turning back at the lower switchback when the drifts blocked the passage. Silas Oryx's prices at the company store climbed as they always climbed when the road worsened the arithmetic of isolation that the camp had always accepted because there was no alternative. There was an alternative now. Or there would be when the time came. Ingrid had not told anyone else about the chamber since she had told Dot. She kept her trips to the head frame timed for early morning when the camp was not yet moving, and late evening when the light was too poor to see clearly across the grade. She restocked her household from the chamber in small amounts, enough to maintain the impression of a widow managing on her stores, not enough to attract the kind of attention that would bring Silas Oryx back to her door. She was watching him, the way prices moved at the store, the way he looked at the head frame when he passed on the grade below, the way he had already positioned himself to profit from whatever the winter brought, which was what he did every winter, which was why his ledger was full of names that would never get clear of what they owed him. She was thinking about that when the first real snow came. Jiangsing Mo Ngin Tam Chum Tam Moi began with a cold front that arrived in 6 hours and dropped the temperature 20 degrees before the sun was down. Ingrid felt it coming the way her father had always claimed. You could feel it if you were paying attention, not in the air exactly, but in the quality of the light in the afternoon, a flatness to it, a removal of depth that happened before the clouds arrived. She spent the afternoon checking the shutter positions 3 times and adding an additional layer of packing sand around the outer potato bins and restocking the household with enough provisions for 2 weeks without needing to open the shaft cover. She was inside with Gus when the wind shifted north and the snow started. By midnight, the road was gone. By dawn, the drifts on the lower grade were 4 feet deep and climbing, and the camp had gone quiet with the particular silence of people who have been cut off and are taking inventory of what they have. What Ingrid had was sufficient for her household and for considerably more than her household. She had known this since October. She had been thinking about how to manage it, how to decide who needed what and when, how to move stores from underground to the households that needed them without creating a situation that Silas Oryx could use against her or a panic that would result in more being taken than was sustainable. She had not finished thinking about it when the knock came at midnight on the 3rd day of the storm. Bryn did not knock loudly. She was not a woman who made noise she did not need to make. But Ingrid was awake, had been awake for hours and heard the sound immediately, and was at the door before Dot knocked a second time. Dot stood in the snow without her coat. She had come out in what she was wearing inside, which meant she had not planned to come, had not made a decision, had simply arrived at a point where standing still was no longer possible. Her cellar Ingrid understood before Dot spoke. The shallow pit under the boarding house floor that Dot had described as adequate and managed with skill and maintained with more attention than most people gave to twice the space. My cellar froze, Dot said. The cabbages are solid. The potatoes are ruined. I have 12 people in the house and 3 days of food left, maybe less. Ingrid did not hesitate. Come to the shaft at first light. Bring baskets. We will work out a system. Dot nodded. Her lips were cracked from the cold. She turned to go back, and Ingrid stepped out and took her by the arm and walked her to the boarding house door and did not go back inside until she heard the latch close. Then she stood in the snow for a moment, looking at the head frame in the dark. She was opening the vault, not just for Dot, for everyone who came after Dot, because once it was open, and there would be others. The mining camp bachelor in the upper cut who had trusted whiskey more than preparation. The family on the eastern claim that had 3 children and half what they needed. The pregnant woman whose husband had overestimated what they could haul before the road closed. She had known this was coming. She had been thinking about it since October. She had not finished thinking about it, but thinking was over now, and doing had begun. She went back inside and sat at the table in the dark and made a list by lamplight of what was in the chamber and what the camp likely needed, and what the chamber could sustain through March if she managed it carefully. The numbers worked. Barely, but they worked. Silas Orek arrived at the head frame on the second day she was distributing stores. He did not come shouting. He came quietly the way a man comes when he wants to assess a situation before he decides what posture to take. He stood at the shaft collar and watched Ingrid lower a bucket and watched it come up with 40 pounds of potatoes in it, and he watched Dot Bryn fill her basket and walk away toward the boarding house. And his face was doing a careful and controlled version of what his face always did when he was calculating. "You are undercutting my prices," he said. "I am not selling anything. Sharing then." He made the words sound like something mildly distasteful. "You are giving away food that people should be buying from my store. Your store has been closed for 2 days because you drove away in your wagon before the storm and have not come back." Orek's expression shifted slightly. "I have a store to run. I have credit to collect. I have costs that do not stop because the road closes. If you feed people for free, you destroy the system that keeps this camp supplied." Ingrid looked at him. She was standing at the windlass with her gloves on and her hands on the crank, and she did not step back from it. "The system you are describing," she said, "is one in which you profit from the fact that people cannot get food from anywhere else. That is not a system. That is a trap," Orek's voice hardened. "You are a widow with a hole in the ground. You have no standing to lecture me about how commerce works." "I have food," Ingrid said. "You have a closed store. We will see which one the camp needs more when the road opens." Orek looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the head frame, at the shaft cover, at the vent boxes rising above the structure. "We will see," he said, "what happens when your charity runs out and you come to my door." He turned and walked back down toward the lower camp. Ingrid watched him go. Then she turned the crank and lowered the next bucket. The third day of the storm was when Gus began coughing. Ingrid heard it from below. She was in the chamber running a final check on the vent positions when the sound came down through 30 feet of shaft and stone thin and wet, the sound of a chest that was working harder than it should. She was up the ladder in 40 seconds, pulling herself through the shaft cover, crossing the frozen ground to the shack door with the cold burning her face and her hands, and not feeling any of it. Gus was on the bed. His face was flushed, and his breathing had a quality to it that she recognized and did not want to recognize. Not a cold. Something heavier than a cold. Something that had settled into the chest and was going to require more than warmth and broth to move. She had seen chest fever take children. She had seen it take adults. She knew what it looked like in the early hours when it could still go either way, and she knew what it looked like later, and she was not going to let it get to later. She built the fire up. She wrapped Gus in both blankets. She made broth from salt pork and gave it to him a spoonful at a time, and talked to him in a low voice about things that did not matter. The spring, the creek at the bottom of the grade, the way the aspens would look in October when this was over. Using her voice the way you use a lamp in a dark room, not because the words mean anything specific, but because the presence of the light matters. Outside, 17 families were depending on the chamber for food. Ragnar Skye appeared at the door an hour after she had come up from the shaft. He was 69 years old, and the past 3 days of cold had taken something from him that she could see in the way he stood and the color around his eyes. He looked past her at Gus on the bed, and he looked back at her, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Go. I can still stand." That was all. No discussion. No offer that needed to be weighed or negotiated. He had made his assessment of the situation and communicated it in 6 words and was already moving toward the shaft cover. She wanted to argue. She looked at his hands, at the steadiness that was not quite what it had been in September, and she wanted to say that she could do both, that she could manage the chamber and tend Gus at the same time, that she did not need to choose. But she had a child with chest fever in a vault that had to be monitored, and a man who was offering to carry one of those two things so she could carry the other. And she had learned enough in the past 3 months to know that the right response to a good offer is not to argue with it. She went back to Gus. Ragnar worked the shaft for 3 days. He moved more slowly than she would have, lifted less weight per trip, rested between lowerings in a way that told her the cold was costing him considerably. But the buckets went down and the buckets came up, and the families waiting at the shaft collar got what they needed, and Ingrid sat by her grandson's bed and was present in the way that the situation required. On the 3rd morning, she was heating broth when she felt something change in the quality of Gus's breathing. a loosening, a depth to it that had not been there for 2 days. She crossed to the bed and put her hand on his forehead, and the fever had broken in the night, and he was sleeping with the specific exhaustion of a body that has fought something hard and won. She sat on the edge of the bed and held his hand and did not speak. After a while, he opened his eyes and looked at her with his grandfather's pale eyes in his father's face. Bowie, he started and then stopped. He said it in Norwegian, the word she had taught him for grandmother, because it was what she was regardless of what the paperwork said. He said, "Is it still winter?" "Yes," she said, "but the worst part is passing." He closed his eyes again and slept. The worst part was not quite passing. On January the 15th, the windlass mechanism locked. Ingrid was at the shaft when it happened, lowering a bucket with 30 pounds of potatoes, and the mechanism simply stopped. The iron ratchet that held the drum position had frozen solid, the cold having worked its way into the metal joints over 3 weeks of daily use, and the bucket hung in the shaft 20 feet down, swinging slightly in the draft from the intake vent going neither up nor down. She tried the crank. It would not move. She tried it with both hands, then with a length of iron bar for leverage. The mechanism was locked as completely as if it had been cast in place. Ragnar came when she called. He was worse than he had been even 2 days ago, the salt and the work of the past weeks having depleted something in him that was not coming back quickly. He looked at the mechanism and worked it with his hands and shook his head. "The chain," he said. "Ich hab." The chain Cormac Dre had left at the head frame in October, a 20-foot coil of heavy freight chain, was rigged as a backup for exactly this situation. But the chain ran over a different drum mount on the opposite side of the head frame structure, and to use it, someone would have to descend the shaft on the chain itself, clear the stuck bucket manually, and come back up, all of this in the dark, in the cold at the bottom of a 30-foot shaft. Ragnar looked at the shaft, then he looked at his hands. Ingrid had already calculated the same thing he was calculating. He was 69 years old and had spent 3 weeks doing work that was costing him more than it was costing her. The chance of him making it down and back up on a freight chain in his current condition was not a chance she was willing to take. Weston Bryce was there. He was 40 years old, a barrel maker who had come to the shaft 3 days ago with baskets for his household and had stayed to help with the lowering and raising because he had looked at the situation and concluded that his hands were useful. He was a large man with the specific kind of physical competence that comes from working with heavy objects in confined spaces for many years. He stepped forward. "I will go down." Ingrid looked at him. "You do not know where to put your feet on the shaft wall," she said. "You do not know how the chain seats on the lower drum housing. If the chain slips while you are working the bucket, you will have nothing." Bryce looked at her. He looked at the shaft. Then she was already moving, tying the rope around her waist the way she had done 100 times, looping it over the backup mount, pulling her gloves tight. The shaft was colder than it had been even a week ago. She could feel it on the first rung. The cold that had worked down through 30 feet of stone and was pooling at the bottom where the frozen mechanism had disrupted the normal airflow. She went down steadily, not fast, feeling each rung before she weighted it, holding the lantern on the cord below her so she could see what she was descending into. The bucket was level with her chest when she reached it, swinging a few inches in the shaft, 40 pounds of potatoes in a canvas sack that had been hanging here for 2 hours. She steadied it with one hand and reached across to the chain housing with the other and worked the lower drum fitting by feel her fingers finding the frost-seized catch and working it back and forth until it broke free and the drum seated correctly on its mount. The bucket could now be raised on the chain system if the main windlass remained locked. But the main windlass did not remain locked. The work of breaking the lower fitting free had transferred enough force up through the chain to jar the frozen ratchet above, and when she climbed back up and Ragnar tried the crank, it turned stiffly at first and then with increasing freedom as the mechanism worked the ice out of its joints. She came up over the shaft collar and Bryce took her arm and steadied her while she found her feet on the frozen ground. Her hands were bleeding where the rope had cut through her gloves at the palms. Her right shoulder would not lift properly. The cold had gone into her in a way that would take hours at the stove to come out. Ragnar looked at her hands. He did not say anything. He began unwrapping the rope from around her waist with the careful movements of a man whose own hands were not much steadier than hers. Bryce was already cranking the windlass, bringing the bucket up. 29 people ate that evening from what the bucket contained. Ingrid sat by the stove with her hands wrapped and her shoulder aching, and Gus beside her warm and eating his portion of potato soup, and she listened to the wind on the roof and counted what she had left in the chamber and calculated how many days to February and whether the road would open before or after she reached the bottom of what her father had built. The numbers were close, not comfortable, but close. She had enough, just enough, if she managed it correctly from here. February came the way February always came, in the Black Hills with a deceit of mildness. In the first days, temperatures rising into the teens, and a stillness in the air that felt like relief, but was not quite relief because you had been wrong about relief before. Then the second week delivered what the first week had withheld, another hard cold that drove the temperature back below zero and kept it there, and she stopped counting days and started counting what was left in the chamber and dividing by the number of mouths she was feeding and arriving at a number that was still adequate but had stopped being comfortable. She had learned something about management that her father's records had not told her directly, and that Ragnar had not said in words, but that the winter itself had been teaching her since December. The difference between a vault that fails and a vault that holds is not the original quantity stored. It is the consistency of attention paid to it every single day, without exception, without days when you are tired or cold or tending a sick child and decide that one morning without checking will not matter. Every morning without exception. She had not missed a morning since October. The stores were holding. The temperature in the chamber had not varied more than 2 degrees in either direction since November. The potatoes in the outer bins were still firm. The grain showed no sign of the mold that could take a barrel from the outside in within a week if the conditions shifted and no one was watching. The ventilation was doing what her father had designed it to do, drawing air through and keeping the atmosphere in the chamber stable and clean. She had done this. She had kept it running. Not Ragnar, though Ragnar had given her what she needed to understand the system. Not Dot, though Dot had confirmed what the food was and was not. Not Cormac Dre, though the chain he had left at the head frame had been the margin between the crisis of the locked windlass and something considerably worse. She had done the daily work. Every morning in the pre-dawn dark, every evening before the light failed entirely, every adjustment and every check and every rotation of stock and every decision about who got what and how much. Her father had built the chamber. She had kept it alive through the worst winter anyone in Pine Coulee could remember. There was a morning in mid-February when she came up from the chamber and stood at the head frame in the thin early light and looked at what the winter had done to the camp around her. The drifts on the lower grade had compressed into a gray-white mass that no longer looked like snow, so much as some geological feature that had always been there. The cabins visible from the shelf had the battered, reduced look of structures that had been arguing with weather for months and were not entirely winning. But the smoke was rising from the chimneys. Every chimney she could see. People were warm. People were fed. Not well. Not the way they would be in April when the road opened and the freight wagons came up with flour and salt, and the ordinary abundance of a supply chain that was functioning, but alive, sustained, carrying the weight of the winter toward the other side of it. She pressed her palm flat against the shaft cover, feeling the cold of the timber under her glove. Somewhere beneath her hand, 30 feet down, through rock and soil, and the accumulated work of 10 years, her father's chamber held what it had been holding since October, quietly and without drama, doing what he had built it to do. She had spent 2 months being angry at him. Not openly, not in any way she would have named as anger. But there had been something underneath the grief of his death that was not purely grief. A residue of all the years she had watched him go down into that shaft while the camp laughed and her husband shook his head, and she herself had looked at the head frame sometimes with the particular exhaustion of someone who has stopped trying to understand a person she loves. Why didn't you tell me? That was the thing she had been not quite thinking for 2 months. Why didn't you explain it? Why did you let them call it a folly for 10 years without saying a single word about what it actually was? She did not have an answer for that yet, but she had been living inside the answer for 2 months without knowing how to read it. Every morning in the cold and the dark, every decision made from the knowledge he had left her, every family that had eaten from what he built. The answer was not in words. It had never been in words. Her father had not been a man of words. He had been a man of work, of accumulated days, of the kind of patience that can sustain a 10-year project that everyone around you has written off as evidence of poor judgment. He had not told her because telling was not his language. He had built it instead. She stood at the head frame until the morning light had strengthened enough to show her the detail of the shaft cribbing at the top, the careful joinery her father had done. The oak pegs fitted into the timber with the precision of a man who did not know how to do work carelessly, regardless of whether anyone was watching. Then she went back inside to start the morning fire and make Gus his breakfast. The road would open. It always opened. And when it did, there would be things to do that she had been thinking about for 2 months, things that the vault had made possible that had not been possible before, things that were not only about her household or her claim or the $47 that had seemed like a canyon in September and now seemed like a detail from another version of her life. The winter was not finished with them yet, but she was beginning to understand that she was going to be finished with it. She had enough. She had kept it alive. She had done what her father had trusted her without telling her to do. For now, that was sufficient. Tomorrow she would think about what came next. The road opened on the 23rd of February. Ingrid heard it before she saw it. The sound of wheels on packed snow, the particular crack of a whip that carries differently in cold air than in warm, the shouting of a driver urging a team through the last of the drifts on the upper switchback. She was at the head frame running her morning check when the sound reached her and she straightened up and stood still for a moment just listening to it. This sound that meant the world had reconnected to itself and the long siege was over. She walked to the edge of the shelf and watched the wagon crest the grade. Cormac Dre was driving. He sat on the box with his coat buttoned to his chin and his hat pulled low and his face red from 6 weeks of whatever he had been doing in Deadwood, while Pine Coulee was cut off, and he brought the team to a stop at the top of the grade and climbed down from the seat with the careful movements of a man whose joints had opinions about the cold. He stood for a moment looking up at the shelf, looking at the head frame, at the vent boxes above the shaft cover, at the path worn in the snow between the shaft and the boarding house, and the path worn between the shaft and the eastern claims, and the path worn between the shaft and the upper cabins where the bachelor miners lived. He had seen enough winter camps to read what those paths meant. He walked up to the head frame and stopped 10 feet from where Ingrid was standing, and he took off his hat and held it in both hands, which was not something she had seen Cormac Dre do before. "I told you that hole would not feed the boy," he said. "I told you he would starve in your arms. I was wrong." Ingrid looked at him. He was not a man who said those words easily. She could hear what it cost him in the flatness with which he delivered them, the absence of any softening, just the fact presented without decoration, because decoration would have been a kind of dishonesty. "You said what you believed," she said. "You had seen it before." "I had seen this before," he said. "Not this exactly." He looked at the head frame again. "Not this." He reached into the wagon bed and lifted something out and carried it to the shaft housing and set it down. A coil of heavy iron chain, new still bright at the links where the metal had not yet oxidized. Longer than the one he had left in October. Heavier gauge. "For the windlass," he said. "In case." He put his hat back on and walked back to the wagon and climbed up and drove the team toward the lower camp without looking back. Ingrid stood at the head frame with the new chain at her feet and watched him go. She was thinking about October, when he had left the first chain without explanation. This man who did not believe in charity and had made what was very nearly a bet, a small, careful wager that she might not fail. She was thinking about what it meant that he was back with a heavier chain before the snow was even off the grade. Before he knew what had happened in the weeks he had been gone. He had known anyway. He had read the paths in the snow, and he had known. She lifted the chain and carried it to the shaft housing and hung it on the backup mount and went back inside to make Gus his breakfast. The camp came back to itself slowly, the way people come back to themselves after something that has cost them more than they expected. The freight wagons brought flour and salt and the basic provisions that the road closure had cut off, and prices at Silas Orrick's store dropped back toward what they had been in autumn, though not quite as far because Orrick was a man who recovered ground when he could. But the camp was different than it had been in December. The difference was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was present in the way people moved between the claims and the conversations at the boarding house table, in the questions that people began asking each other about where they had stored their food and how much they had kept back and what had worked and what had not. People who had survived on what Ingrid's Night vault had provided them were thinking about how to not need someone else's vault next winter. People who had managed adequately on their own stores were thinking about how they could have managed better. The questions started coming to Ingrid before the snow was off the grade. She answered them honestly, which meant she answered them completely, without softening the difficult parts, or pretending that the system her father had built was simpler than it was. She drew diagrams on scraps of paper. She walked claim boundaries and pointed to drainage lines and frost depths. She repeated what Ragnar had taught her in the language of people who had not spent their lives underground, translating the principles from the vocabulary of drift mining into something a homesteader or a boarding house keeper or a bachelor miner could use. The teaching was harder than she expected, not because the people were unwilling, because explaining something you understand in your hands and your instincts requires a different kind of knowledge than the thing itself. She had understood this in her father's records, which were precise and logical, and which she had spent 3 months learning to read. She began to understand it differently when she watched blank faces looking back at her while she described vent positioning, and she realized that what she was doing wrong was the same thing that most people did wrong when they tried to transfer knowledge. She was describing results. She was not describing failure. The reason the vents needed to be positioned correctly was not abstract. It was specific and visual and consequential. Condensation on the ceiling. Mold starting in the corner of a grain barrel where you would not see it until it had traveled 6 inches in every direction. A potato that felt firm on the outside and was soft in the center in a way that meant the rot had already spread to its neighbors. She started taking people down into the chamber on humid days. Let them see the corners where moisture collected when the shutters were wrong. Let them smell the difference between air that was moving correctly and air that was beginning to go dead. Let them press their thumb against a potato that was a week away from failing and feel what that specific softness meant. They understood. Not all of them, but enough of them. Ragnar Sky did not come back after the road opened. She had expected him to appear at the head frame on the first clear morning the way he had appeared every other morning since September, moving up the grade, with his tools and his economy of motion and his manner of teaching that required nothing from her except attention and effort. She waited 3 days. Then she walked down to the lower camp and knocked on the door of the room he rented from a widow on the south side of the boarding house row. The widow told her that Ragnar had taken to his bed in the second week of February and had not been well since. She said it the way people said such things about old men who had been hard on themselves for too long, with a particular acceptance that was not indifference but was close to it, the acceptance of someone who has watched this before and knows how it ends. Ingrid sat with him for an hour that afternoon. He was in the bed with his hands folded on the blanket, not sleeping, watching the ceiling with the careful attention of a man who has run out of things to do and is making his peace with that. She told him about the windlass, about the locked mechanism and the frozen ratchet and the 30 pounds of potatoes hanging in the shaft at 20 feet. She told him how she had gone down on the chain and freed the bucket and come up with her hands bleeding and her shoulder wrong, and how Weston Bryce had been cranking the windlass before she was fully back on her feet. Ragnar listened without changing his expression. When she finished, he said, "Your father would have done it the same way." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She asked if she could bring him anything. He said no. She sat with him another few minutes and then stood to go, and at the door she turned back. "The marks on the board," she said, "the ones I still cannot read, the ones about the secondary ventilation adjustment." Ragnar looked at her from the bed. His pale eyes were clear, even if the rest of him was not. "You already know," he said. "You worked it out in January. You just do not trust that you worked it out correctly." She thought about January, about the morning she had adjusted the intake shutter to a position not shown in her father's records, a position between the two marked positions because the weather conditions that morning had been between the two conditions her father had notated, and the position she had chosen had produced exactly the result she wanted. She had written it in her notebook as a question. She had not written it as a fact because she had not been sure. "Write it as a fact," Ragnar said. She looked at him. He was watching the ceiling again. She walked back to the claim and opened her notebook and crossed out the question mark. Ragnar Sky died in the second week of June. Weston Bryce came up the grade to tell her. He came with a wagon load of barrel staves, which was his habit, now arriving every week or 10 days, with materials or tools or information staying to help with whatever was being done, leaving when the work was finished. He was 40 years old and had the particular quality of presence that meant he occupied exactly the space he was in, and no more, which was something Ingrid had come to appreciate in the months since January. He told her about Ragnar, the way he told her most things directly, and without softening because he had learned in the weeks of working alongside her that she preferred the truth in its actual shape. She said nothing for a moment. She was at the surface sorting shed, turning over potatoes from the spring stores, checking for the first signs of the warm weather spoilage that was different from cold weather spoilage in ways she had learned to distinguish. Her hands continued their work while she absorbed what he had told her. "He left something for you," Weston said. "He gave it to me 2 weeks ago, said I should bring it when the time came." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, the heavy kind slightly worn at the edges from being carried. He held it out and she took it and set it on the sorting table without opening it. She finished checking the potatoes first, every one. Then she washed her hands at the water barrel and dried them on her apron and picked up the envelope and went inside. The handwriting was cramped and careful. The letters formed with the precision of a man who had spent most of his life working with measurements and had applied the same standard to everything he did. She read it at the table by the window in the afternoon light that was nothing like the winter light she had been living in for months, warm and direct and full of the specific generosity of a June afternoon in the Black Hills, when the worst of what the season could do was behind you. Ingrid, the letter began. "Your father and I worked together for 6 years before he quit the drift. He was not an easy man to know. He did not talk when he could be silent. He did not explain when he could demonstrate. He held his knowledge the way some men hold their money carefully and close, not from greed, but from kind of privacy that went all the way down. When he quit the drift to dig his well, I thought he had lost something. A man spends 20 years underground and then one day decides to dig a hole on his own claim and tell no one what he is doing. I thought the darkness had taken something from him. I told him so. He listened and did not answer and went back to his digging. I did not understand until I saw what you did with what he left. He was not building a well. He was not even building a vault, not exactly. He was building something for you. I do not think he knew how to say that. I do not think he had the words for it, or if he had the words, he did not trust them to carry what he meant. So he built instead. Everything he learned in 20 years underground, everything he understood about temperature and moisture and air and stone he put into that chamber. Not because he knew you would need it, because he could not tell you he loved you in any language but work. I have taught you what I know. You know more than I gave you. You knew more than I thought you could in September, and you know more than I know now. The rest you will learn by teaching others, and that is how it should move. Hand to hand, not written down, not in books, through hands. Keep building. And when the boy is old enough, teach him too. That is how we stay alive after we die, Ragnar." She sat at the table for a long time after she finished reading. The afternoon light moved across the floor, and the sounds of the camp came through the window. The ordinary sounds of a summer day, distant voices and the ring of a hammer somewhere on the lower claims, and the creek running fast with snowmelt below the grade. She had not cried when her father died. She had not cried when Arvid died, or when her son died, or when the winter had taken what it had taken from her and from everyone around her. She had done what needed doing and kept moving because stopping was not an option, and grief was something you carried without setting down. She cried now. Not for Ragnar, though she would miss him in the specific way you miss someone who has given you something that cannot be replaced. Not for her father, though the letter had given her something she had not known she needed a shape, for what she had always suspected, but never been able to see clearly. She cried for all of it together, the 10 years her father had dug while the camp laughed, and she had watched without understanding the 2 years she had spent carrying deaths without setting them down, the winter that had required everything she had, and found each time that she had slightly more than she thought. Gus appeared in the doorway. He had been somewhere outside doing whatever 10-year-old boys did on summer afternoons when the work was not pressing, and he looked at her at the table and came inside without speaking, and sat beside her, and put his hand over hers the way she had put her hand over his at his great-grandfather's grave. They sat that way until the light changed. Then she folded the letter and put it in the tobacco tin where her father had kept his papers next to the twig of candle wax from the sealed note that had started everything, and she went outside to finish checking the summer stores. Silas Orek came to the claim on a morning in late June. She saw him climbing the grade from the window and watched him come without going out to meet him. He was moving differently than he had moved in October when he had come to the head frame with his folded paper and his calculated expression. The confidence was still there. It was a quality built too deeply into him to dissolve in one hard winter, but something underneath it had shifted. When she came out to meet him, he was standing at the shaft housing with his hat in his hands. He told her his vault had failed. He had built it in April after the road opened, before she had started teaching people systematically. He had dug it himself and built the vent boxes himself and installed the shelving himself, and believed, because he was Silas Orek, and he had built a functioning commercial enterprise in a mining camp at the end of a mountain road, that he was capable of building a functional underground storage system without instruction. The drainage was wrong, he said. The floor sloped toward the wall. Moisture collected in the corner. The potatoes rotted from the outside in. By the time he found it, the rot had spread to the second bin. He said it the way a man says something he has been holding for some time and has finally decided that holding it is costing him more than saying it. And the grain, he said. The grain went first, mold at the top of the barrel. I lost both barrels before I caught it. She looked at him. She looked at his hands, which were not the hands of a man who did fine work. Strong hands, capable of a great deal. Not built for the kind of tolerance that underground storage required in its joinery and its fitting. Your ventilation shafts are too close together, she said. They create a dead zone in the center where the air does not circulate, and your floor drainage is wrong, which I cannot fix without digging out the floor and regrading it. Orek looked at her steadily. Can it be made to work? She considered. With daily attention, yes. If you rotate the stock more frequently than the records suggest, and check for moisture every morning, and never allow the circulation to stagnate, you can compensate for the structural problems. But you will work twice as hard for the same result that a correctly built chamber produces without the extra effort. He was quiet for a moment. Will you show me how? She looked at him. The man who had come to her door in October with a folded paper and a calculation about who would fail and what that failure would cost him. The man who had raised prices while the camp was cut off. The man who had stood at the shaft housing in January while she was lowering buckets and told her she was destroying the system. She thought about what Ragnar's letter had said about her father, that he had not been easy to know, that he had held his knowledge carefully and close, that he had built instead of spoken. She thought about the difference between those two things, the holding and the building, and about which one served the people around you and which one served only yourself. She thought about Orek's niece. The girl had eaten from the vault through the worst weeks of February, one of the 17 families she had been feeding from what her father built. The girl had been 8 years old and had played with Gus on the better days before the storm, and had died of diphtheria in the summer outbreak, when nothing Ingrid had and nothing the camp had could stop what the disease was doing. It was not the winter that took her, but she had survived the winter because of what was in the chamber. Orek had not said this. He had not mentioned his niece. She did not know if he was thinking about it. She decided it did not matter whether he was thinking about it. The only way to stop being the man you were, she had understood through the winter, was to become someone else. You could not do that alone. And she was not in the business of deciding who deserved the help that would make it possible. Come down tomorrow morning, she said. Bring your tools. I will show you what your father's marks mean and what your floor needs and how the circulation should work when it is right. The rest is work. That part is yours. He put his hat back on. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting terms he recognizes are fair, even if he is not accustomed to accepting terms he has not set. He came the next morning. He came the morning after that. He was not a fast learner in the way that some people are fast learners, picking up principles quickly and applying them broadly. He was a thorough learner, the kind who needed to understand the mechanism before he trusted it, who asked the same question twice from different angles to make sure the answer was consistent. It was not a quality she had expected to find in him. She adjusted her teaching accordingly. By August, his vault was holding. Not perfectly. The structural problems she had diagnosed required compensating techniques that added time to his daily maintenance. But the temperature was stable and the potatoes were firm and the grain was dry, and he was checking the moisture every morning the way she had told him to. He never became someone she would have called a friend. Some distances cannot be entirely crossed, but he became the person in Pine Coulee who told newcomers when they asked where to learn about underground storage to go to the head frame above the grade and ask for Ingrid Halston. He said it without softening the history, without pretending that he had not spent 2 years on the wrong side of it. That was worth more than friendliness. That was the particular kind of conversion that meant something. The summer and autumn of 1881 passed in a rhythm of teaching and building that changed the shape of Pine Coulee in ways that would not be fully visible for another year, but that were present already in the turned earth, on half a dozen claims, the new head frames rising on the hillsides, the conversations at Dot Brin's boarding house table that had shifted from the price of flour to the angle of ventilation shafts. 8 families completed vaults before the first frost of 1881. 3 more would finish by early winter. Dot Brin's boarding house chamber was the largest and most sophisticated of the new constructions built with the advice of everyone who had learned from Ingrid and incorporating modifications that Ingrid herself had not thought to make because Dot had been thinking about large-scale food storage for years and had specific requirements that a household vault did not need to address. Weston Bryce made barrels for every new vault. He had stopped thinking of this as a separate enterprise from what Ingrid was doing sometime in April, and had started thinking of it as the same enterprise which it was. She filled barrels. He made them. The work required both and was insufficient without either. He was present the way the best kind of presence is present as a fact of the situation rather than a demand on it. He did not ask for acknowledgement. He did not require that the arrangement be named. He showed up when there was work and did the work and was easy to be around in the specific way of people who have found the thing they are supposed to be doing and are doing it. Ingrid noticed this. She had been noticing it since January in the peripheral way that people notice things they are not yet ready to think about directly. She let it be peripheral for a while longer. There were vaults to build and people to teach and a winter to prepare for, and the winter did not wait for readiness. The autumn of 1882 came clear and cold, the aspens going gold on the north-facing ridges, and the air carrying what it always carried at that altitude in October, the knowledge of what was coming dressed in the last of what had been. Ingrid stood at the head frame on the last day of October and looked out over the camp below her. She counted 11 vent boxes visible from where she stood rising above the ground on the hillsides around Pine Coulee, like the chimneys of a different kind of dwelling homes that went down instead of up, storing what the winter would try to take. Gus came out of the house and stood beside her. He was 11 now, a year older than he had been in the worst of the winter, taller by 2 inches, with the particular steadiness of a child who has been through something hard and knows he was not destroyed by it. He looked at the vent boxes on the hillsides the way she was looking at them. Grandfather knew, he said, when he was digging all those years while everyone laughed. He knew we would need it. Ingrid was quiet for a moment, thinking about her father in the way she thought about him now, which was different from how she had thought about him when he was alive, and different again from how she had thought about him in the first months after he died. Clearer, more complete, I think he hoped, she said, and sometimes hope is enough. Gus considered this. The wind moved through the pines on the ridge above them, the same sound it had always made, the sound she had been hearing since she first came to this shelf above the grade with Arvid, and the idea of a future they were going to build together. When do we start teaching me the secondary vent adjustment? Gus said. She looked at him. Tomorrow, she said, when the light is good and you can see what I am showing you. He nodded, satisfied. The nod of someone who has asked the right question and received the right answer and considers the matter settled. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was cold but not cruel. The road closed twice, once for 9 days in January and once for 12 days in February, but neither closure produced the desperation of the previous year. The vault Ingrid operated fed her household and contributed to 3 others through the January closure. The 8 new vaults on the hillsides fed the families who had built them, and a total of 41 additional people across the 2 closures. No one starved, no one froze for want of food. The camp that had come within a week of serious crisis 2 winters before moved through this winter with the particular competence of a community that has learned something and has not forgotten it. Cormac Drake came up the grade when the road opened after the January closure. He stood at the head frame and looked at the vent boxes on the hillsides and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Your father built one. You built 11. 12, Ingrid said. Dot's boarding house chamber is the largest. It serves 16 people in a bad closure. Cormac looked at the vent boxes. He pulled the stub of pencil from his vest pocket, the same one he always carried, and the scrap of paper. He held them out to her. She looked at him. "Write me the measurements," he said. "The depths, the vent, angles, the drainage specifications. I have freight clients in the 4 other camps that have the same problem you had 2 winters ago. Bad stores, poor preparation, 1 hard week away from serious trouble." She took the pencil. She thought for a moment about the right way to begin, about what her father would have written and what Ragnar would have said, and what she had learned about the difference between describing a result and describing how to get there. She wrote for 20 minutes. Measurements, angles, the common mistakes, and why they mattered, the things you had to check every morning, and what you were checking for. She wrote in the notation her father had used on the slate board because it was the most precise format she knew, and she added in plain English what each notation meant because Cormac was not her father and did not speak that particular language. She handed him 4 pages of closely written specifications. He looked at them. He put them in his coat pocket beside his manifest papers, which was where he kept things he considered important. He climbed back on the wagon. "What do I owe you?" he said. "Tell them where it came from," she said. "If they ask who designed it, tell them about my father. Tell them about a man who spent 10 years digging what everyone called a dry well." Cormac looked at her for a moment. "And if they ask about the woman who kept it running through the worst winter in a decade," he said, "what do I tell them then?" "Tell them the truth," she said, "that she had $47 and a child and nowhere to go, and she went down instead of out." Cormac nodded. He drove the team back down the grade. The children who grew up in Pine Coulee in the years that followed called the paired vent boxes on the hillsides Halston vents, and the name spread into the camps beyond the grade, with the freight wagons and the miners moving between claims, and by the time the expression had traveled far enough that no one in its new location knew exactly where it had originated, it had become simply the name for a thing, the way all names eventually detach from their origins and become only themselves. The dry well, which was what the camp had called it for a decade, stopped being called that sometime in the middle 1880s. Not because anyone made a decision about it, because the name no longer fit what the thing was, and names that no longer fit eventually fall away on their own. What replaced it was not a name exactly. It was a fact. The Halston chamber, the vault on the shelf, the place you went to learn how to build one of your own. Ingrid kept building, not because the world was not changing, not because coal and railroad access and the industrial supply chains of a modernizing country were not making certain kinds of frontier preparation less urgent than they had been, but because the knowledge was worth keeping, regardless of whether the emergency that had revealed it recurred, because the understanding of how to maintain food through controlled conditions and careful attention was not specific to any particular crisis, but was useful in any situation where supply chains failed, or weather intervened, or the usual ways of doing things stopped working without warning. And because her father had spent 10 years acquiring it, and Ragnar had spent 60 years acquiring the deeper version of it that had let her read what her father left. And both of them had put it in her hands, specifically the one because he could not say what he meant in any other language, and the other because he recognized that she was the right person to carry it forward. You do not put down something like that, not when you understand what it costs to pass it to you. The head frame stood on the shelf above Ravengrade for another 40 years, weathering through summers and winters until the wood had the silver-gray color that old timber in high, dry country develops when it has been standing in the wind for long enough. The shaft cover was replaced twice, and the windlass mechanism was rebuilt once by Gus, who had learned to read the secondary vent adjustment by the time he was 13 and the full system by the time he was 16. Ingrid taught until she could not climb the ladder. Then she taught from the surface, describing what she could no longer demonstrate, answering questions from a knowledge so deep and practiced it had stopped being knowledge and had become instinct, the kind that lives in the hands and the nose and the palm pressed flat against the earth. When visitors came to Pine Coulee in the later years, the ones who had heard about the widow on the shelf and wanted to understand what had happened in the winter of 1881, she told them the same thing she had told Gus that October afternoon at the head frame. They usually wanted the technical details first. The depths and the angles and the vent positions and the thermal stability numbers that made the system work in ways that conventional storage could not match. She gave them those. She drew the diagrams. She answered the questions about moisture and rotation and the daily maintenance that no one wanted to hear about because daily maintenance was not dramatic, and everyone wanted to know about the dramatic parts. But the technical details were not what she wanted them to leave with. What she wanted them to leave with was this. A man had spent 10 years doing work that everyone around him had decided was evidence of poor judgment. He had done it in the specific silence of someone who does not have the words for what he is trying to say and has decided to say it anyway in the only language available to him, which was work and time and the accumulated weight of days. He had not told his daughter what he was building. He had not explained it. He had built it and trusted that when the time came, she would find it and know what it was. He had been right about that, not because she was exceptional, because she was paying attention, because she had gone down into the dark with a lantern and looked at what was there instead of assuming she already knew. Because when she found something that did not match what she had been told to expect, she had trusted what she found over what she had been told. That was all it was. Looking at what was actually there, trusting what you found. The rest was work. The rest was always work. And the work done with attention every morning without exception through the cold and the dark and the doubt and the particular loneliness of being certain about something that no one around you has yet seen would produce what it always produced when it was sustained long enough. Not certainty, not vindication, not the satisfaction of being proved right, which was a smaller thing than people imagined and faded faster. Something else. Something that was present in the warmth rising through 30 feet of bedrock from a chamber her father had built while the camp laughed. Something that was in the letter Ragnar had written in a cramped hand on heavy paper and asked Weston Bryce to carry up the grade when the time came. Something that was in the paths worn in the February snow between the shaft and the 16 households that had eaten from what Aslak Halston spent 10 years making. Evidence. Not of her own capability, though, that was there too. But evidence of something older and more durable than any single winter or any single act of survival. That what one person understands and builds and leaves behind does not disappear when that person does. That knowledge passed hand to hand, the way Ragnar had said it should pass, does not diminish with each passing. It accumulates. It refines. It becomes over time, and through enough hands something that belongs to no one and to everyone, which is the only kind of belonging that survives the particular mathematics of time. Aslak Halston had built one vault. Ingrid Halston had built 12 and taught the people who built 30 more. And the children of those people and the children of those children called the vent boxes on the hillsides by a name they had inherited without knowing its origin, the way all inherited things eventually detach from their source and become only themselves. Halston vents, the folly that fed a town, the dry well that was never dry, the hole in the ground that an old man dug in silence for 10 years so that his daughter would not be cold when he was gone. She pressed her palm flat against the shaft cover in the October light and felt the cool of the timber under her hand and the deep stability of the earth below it, the temperature that did not change with the seasons. The stillness that existed because her father had known where to find it and had spent 10 years of his life making it accessible. The worst they had said about him was that he was a fool. The kindest was that he meant well and got it wrong. He had not gotten anything wrong. He had simply been working in a language that took 10 years to say what it needed to say, and he had died before he could be certain she had heard it. She had heard it. She heard it every morning when she opened the shaft cover and the cool air came up from below, and she heard it in the letter Ragnar had written, and she heard it in the sound of 11 vent boxes moving air through 11 chambers on 11 hillsides around Pine Coulee, each one a translation of what her father had known, into a form the camp could use. She heard it now in the October afternoon, with the aspens gold on the ridge, and Gus inside finishing his schoolwork, and the winter 11 weeks away, and the chamber fully stocked, and the vents adjusted correctly for the dropping evening temperature. She heard it as clearly as she had ever heard anything. He had loved her in the only language he had, and she had finally learned to speak it back.